Good morning, everybody. Dear guests, thank you for everybody who's coming here. I'm very happy that we have come together today in order to discuss a very dividing topic of wind power. Today, wind power is the visible symbol of modern climate policy. Wind power stands for the utopia that nature can provide clean energy in unlimited quantities without wasting resources. But nobody wants it in the backyard, and now we have it in the backyard. So today we are gathered here in the European Parliament, Europeans from Sweden, Netherlands, France, Germany, united to share facts. It has been months of planning to assemble this conference, and I'm grateful that my co-host, MEP Roos, came on board with a unique experience and competence. Thank you, Rob. I'm also grateful that former Minister of National Education in Poland, MEP Anna Zalewska, will share the panel that starts at 10 o'clock. It is an honor that she dedicated her time, especially since Poland is holding national election on Sunday. With these words, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Rob Roos. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johan. And very welcome, everyone. I think it's good that we are together, share our views on the wind industry. I call it on purpose that way because that's what it is. It is an industry instead of an energy production. I think it's very good that we shine a light on the production, on the environmental elements, and yeah, at what cost? Because it's not only the price, but it's also the environment. And here in this parliament, we are always busy with biodiversity, the environment. But when it comes to wind energy, it seems that everything is possible. No one looks at it. And we raised many times the questions about the cost of wind energy. And well, the problem is that they really, the thing is they are not interested in all the facts. So it's good that we show some facts over here. It's recorded, we can share it. And we have a panel, 3 persons, and the first person is Dr. Per Hansen. Dr. Per Hansen is an experienced guide in forest and fields and has a master's degree in land and environmental law. He is also an associate professor in applied forest pathology, a researcher and teacher. He teaches conservation, forest management, and boreal ecology. He's very knowledgeable and experienced in ornithologist. Do I say that right? Yeah, for me it was a new word, but it's a bird ecologist. I also still learn a lot, and has over the years acquired a great knowledge of species. For more than 40 years, Per has been an ambassador for birds. He will talk about the environmental impact of the wind industry, especially on birds. And I want to give you the floor, Per. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. And thank you, Johan, Nissinen. And I will thank also Anna Zalewska for giving me the opportunity to come here. Actually, it's the first time that tax money, public finance, is inviting me to tell stories about what really happens. So I have a message that is maybe not so popular in at least in Swedish societies. As Robert said, I'm a mixture of forestry, ornithology, and environmental law. So I'm an odd person in that way. I have been dealing with this type of environmental impact assessments in over 30 years. So I've been a specialist in reading in between the lines. What is not written, that is almost always the most important. I have noticed also that the wind power industry, I agree with Robert, that is really the right word. Has so much financial support and so much economy that they are really mighty and strong establishment. I'm sorry for I speak Swinglish, so I think you understand anyway. So to take the most important first, I would say if you think of me, you should think that I think wind energy, that in that matter, the wind is green. Everything else around the wind industry is not green. So there is so much problem around this. It's very area intensive. You need so much area. You destroy so much environment that former has been free for the birds, free for the bats, and for the insects to use. So, okay, next slide. Just a short presentation. My starting with a voluntary ornithology is really this crane color marking. We have an interesting project all around Europe, Northern Europe, Sweden, Norway, Finland, to put color rings on the legs on the cranes to understand where they migrate. So we have a recent publication with the map to the left. You can see where the Nordic trains are migrating. And as you can see, most of them are passing right over here on their way down to the winters in Spain along the oaks, korkekar in Swedish. I don't know that in English. So that was maybe the first, the start of my thinking of the greater picture of the migration routes. So that is the cranes started that. Next, please. After I decided to start an own company, and as a free researcher, I got funding from this foundation, Marie Claire Kronstedts Stiftelse, to make a bigger research about bird migration. And I started to compile where the red listed, the most threatened, the birds that are sensitive for wind power and that are using the thermal winds to migrate, the big birds, so to say. So that is the project. And next, please. It has been a fantastic data set, over 200, about almost 300,000 reports from up to 50 years from voluntary ornithologists or bird watchers. And together they have counted over 13 million migrating raptors. And the maps here to the left is show the most to the left is showing where all the blue dots are where the birds are coming in the spring from southwest or southeast, and the right panel is a special species called rough-legged buzzard. It's wintering mostly actually in Poland. It's migrating to southwest, so it's especially interesting for Polish and also actually down to Ukraine. So it's a southeast migrating bird. It is when it come back, you can see the blue dots are concentrated in northern Sweden in the Bottnian Bay, and I live right in that spot. So I always think of this big pattern when I'm home at my house. So that is the very interesting pattern. You can take the next, please. So just to be very short, to the left you can see what do you see? The lungs, the tracheids, the respiratory system. To the right you can see top right the land birds migrating routes roughly, and to the bottom right you can see the waterfall migrating roughly. So the land birds of course avoid water. The water birds the opposite. They search for the water. So you have to, when you plan the wind power, you have to imply all this knowledge, and I mean that is not done enough. It's a lot of protection areas more to be decided, and Sweden has actually been told by the Commission, EU Commission, to make more Natura 2000 networks area in the Baltic Sea, and I agree fully. So I think it got too quickly when Sweden came into the EU, and now we have to repair that. More areas has to be protected, and I suggest that those flyways where thermal bottleneck sites should be the first one to protect. So next, please. As you can see, and as you know, it's a real problem. The rotor blades are really mortal for big birds. That is not, you can't tell that much times. So you can take next. And even if the bird, in this case the eagle you just saw, is hit by the rotor blade, it maybe not die directly, but it can be thrown away and land several hundred meters and walk slowly and hide in a bush and die. So, and besides that, even they are walking long distance from the collision place, they then are eaten by foxes, other predators, a lot of what's that in? Carnivores are taking the prey, and that also the case for small birds and bats. And concerning insects, you all know that the rotor blade has to be cleaned regularly because they are smacked with insects. And you have all heard that we have a crash in insects population. So why is the environmental association so silent about this? I can't understand it. Really, I'm worried. Why do the green associations keep so silent about this? So, okay, next. So, the authorities, what did they say when I presented those 10 different hotspots, bottleneck sites? Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Hansson. We appreciate your research. And then nothing. Nobody has invited me to tell more. Not the Swedish Agency of Protection, not the Swedish Agency for Marine and Water Management, not even BirdLife Sweden, not the Swedish SNF, what's that in Svenska Naturskyddsföreningen, the Swedish biggest environmental association. They have not invited me. So this is the first time that tax money is used for giving me a possibility to tell you this. So I'm very, very grateful, very grateful. So none of those 10 hotspots are protected, but I think we should do it as soon as possible. And we should calm down, not take this wind power. I'm not against wind power, but it should be, it couldn't go so, now it's too hard pressure. It's so big, so quick. There is so easy to make the wrong decision. So we have to calm down, some kind of temporary stop in the construction, I suggest, and then we should compile all those knowledge and take care of it carefully. Okay, I don't know the time now. Is how much time I do have? And you know, take the next.
Yeah, try to maybe.
I'm close to the end. Yeah. I have much to tell you, but I make a funny chat with the OpenAI ChatGPT and asked what word do you know about hiding the truth inside other words? So the ChatGPT suggests a half truth is a whole lie, and that is interesting. So as I said in the beginning, most of the AI environmental impact assessments are full of half lies, half truth, whole lies. So I think that is the last. Take next. No, of course, the eagle has landed. The eagle tell you, we don't want you to panic. We want you to think. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hansen. Very interesting, and it confirms that what we all thought, they are not really interested in facts. It's time that they ask you for what's really going on, and that we show the world that it's very necessary. Before we go on, I'd like to thank, because we forgot during the introduction to thank the interpreters. It's very important that we have a translation in Polish, in English, in French, and in Dutch. So these people make it possible that that this will be not a Babylonian confusion, and that we all can understand each other. Thank you so much for that, and also for the technicians who make it possible that we have all these presentations and the online broadcast. For now, we have the next speaker, but for me it's unclear. Because we changed the order, is Mr. Shrum online? Ah, that's great. Great. Then we're going to the next speaker. The next speaker is Professor Dr. Karina Shrum. She's the director of the Institute of Coastal Systems, Herion Institute and University in Hamburg. Let me see, I have some more introduction. Professor Shrum has a broad interdisciplinary expertise in coastal research. She has studied dynamics of various coastal systems using coupled modeling together with a broad range of observations as a primary research tool. She studies dynamics and decadal and to multi-decadal variability of shelf systems. A significant part of Professor Shrum's research efforts went into development of coupled models. Current focus on her research is the impact of multiple drivers on matter transport, marine ecosystems, and organisms, and the predictability potential for marine resources. Professor Shrum guided the compilation of a number of modeling databases and observational-based gridded products, which have now found their way in a wider research community. Professor Shrum, very welcome. You are online. The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm speaking to you now from Germany, using energy, which we all need to sustain our normal life. And of course, I'm not against energy production, not against renewable energy production, but I'd like to tell you a little bit about what I know, what we know and what we not know about how offshore renewable wind energy production changes the environment. And I will strongly rely on research we did for the North Sea. Next slide, please. When we look into the offshore energy production in the North Sea, we do see now it is not anymore animated as I did it for you, but we see an area which is already a hot spot in the North Sea. And we are expecting further development. These are outlined by political declarations, starting out with the Esbjerg Declaration, which was a joint declaration by Germany, Belgium, Denmark, and Netherlands to increase the energy productions in their exclusive economic zones in the eastern North Sea, up to 150 gigawatts in and by 2050 roundabout, and would also like to produce offshore hydrogen. And then, of course, the Ostende Declaration came, and this is now the entire North Sea states involved there, and they made up a big plan for the North Sea to increase from today around about 30 gigawatt to 118 gigawatt in 2030, which is soon, and to more than 300 gigawatts, 300 and more gigawatts by 2050. How that looks like, you can see on the figure here with the colored spaces areas here. You see offshore wind which is already installed, producing already, but also those ones which are built and planned in blue. And you also see the areas which are sort of considered for the coming plans here. And when you look at that, you see that the North Sea is really largely affected by these plans. And we see that there is also some interference with marine protected areas, which are the green and lilac areas here identified, which are nature conservation protection spaces. And we see that the mega use here raise a competition for space. So space, but also energy are limited resources in the North Sea and probably also elsewhere. And also there's these interference in terms of space, and it also limits space for fisheries. Next slide, please. But this is not the only part of the story I'd like to tell you. Also, the energy extraction itself changes the environment. It's not just a border for animals there or a disturbance, but it's also changing the environment. And you see that from a picture extracted from remote sensing. You see the area here. This is the German Bight, and it's a beautiful area also seen from space. If you zoom in here, which is done here in the red square, you see a nice illustration how the offshore wind farms, which are the small or the windmills are the small red dots, how they change the environment. First of all, you see the wind coming from below the picture here in red, and it creates large-scale offshore wind wakes, a structure in the atmosphere. And then also the currents which meet the piles, they create wakes in the water, which are also turning around because of the tidal currents which are turning. And these are the structures you see here, a little bit more pronounced and shorter. And are driven by the current direction meeting the piles, and the current direction is indicated here in green. Next slide, please. So the energy, that is what we know, what we see already, that the energy extraction is changing the environment. It's not just immediately replaced, but it has a sort of spatial dimension before energy from upper levels in the atmosphere is replaced again. And we know when we look into that in a more spatial connection and look into that using the models to look into the future, how will a future a production pattern change the environment, we see that we find a decrease of wind. Roundabout in larger scales, 10%, locally even up to 20%. And we see that we will expect decreasing wind. And of course also a change in the potential for future wind farms. And these decrease in wind will also trigger changes in current structures, and these are large scale. So they are influenced not only within the area, not only the small pile structures, but they also mix the ocean, and they are propagating in the environment. And these changes will by itself trigger changes in food web structure and ecosystems, which we also have looked for a certain scenario, which is approximately the 2030 scenario. And you see here in colors the lower figure indicating that there are changes, and these changes in primary production, which is the base of all of the entire food web, is in the order of 10%. Next slide, please. So that is what we know. But what we don't know is actually what the consequences are for commercial fish stocks and for protected species, for protected areas, and how nature protection, fisheries, and energy production can be combined. We have just very little knowledge about that. And we neither know what are the limits of the energy production. So we have these big plans, but we have not the research made up for these plans that we really can assess that. Yeah, next slide, please. On the final slide, I have put you some literature here, which you also can look up later. But all what I said here is published research and verified also by colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Schramm. Very interesting and very. I think it underlines what. The European Court of Auditors also came up 2 weeks ago in a special report. They said that offshore energy in the European Union, that the ambitions are very high and that they have no idea what the risks are. And I think this underlines what's going on. And it's good that we have also this information and attention for the risk on basis of your presentation. Thank you so much. I have a question, but we do that in the end. We go to the next speaker, and the next speaker is someone I know for quite a while because we work together. It's former professor, Dr. Lucas Bergkamp. He has a very special CV. Dr. Lucas Bergkamp is a medical doctor and also a lawyer in Brussels. He focuses on European law and in its relationship with international and national law, particularly in the field of risk regulation. He is the co-writer of a report on the spatial requirements of wind and nuclear energy and their prospective costs. This is the report, and it's peer-reviewed by Professor Nordhaus, climate econom, and this peer-reviewed publication for ECR Group and Renew Europe. This is extremely interesting and dense study, and we have asked him to focus on the spatial requirements of the wind industry. Professor Bergkamp, it's good to have you here again. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to be here. I think it's a great initiative to look at the wind industry, which indeed has really taken off quite significantly. And as was indicated by previous speakers, we do not yet fully understand all the consequences of this new development, in particular not the adverse consequences, which traditionally have always been a great focus of the European Union in particular, since in the treaty we do have enshrined the so-called precautionary principle. But apparently precaution doesn't apply when the wind industry is involved. And also apparently the European Union feels it's appropriate to forgo environmental impact assessment in relation to many of these large-scale projects, because it's sort of good for the climate is the idea. Well, that's of course the critical question that we are addressing today. How, is it good for the climate is one thing, but secondly, you always have to consider what the adverse implications are of wind power, and those have not yet been addressed. Among those adverse implications is the space required by wind power. And that's the issue I will be talking about now in some more detail. Next slide, please. So the key concept here is energy density, which is a concept that really provides information about the amount of energy that's stored in a given system or in a given material. And that energy then can be extracted from the system or the material and then be converted into energy that's useful to human beings. In the case of power production, we of course are talking about generating electricity. Now, low energy density means that you need more space to produce the same amount of energy. The problem with wind energy is that it has low density, even lower than solar, for instance. And of course, if you compare to nuclear, as we'll do in a moment, then you'll see how big the difference really is. It's not 10 times, but it's more hundreds of times more energy dense nuclear, that is, and thus wind energy is in that regard quite inefficient. What we do see now is that as competition for space for land becomes more vigorous and land and space becomes scarcer, the public opposition to wind power is increasing, and in response to that, then wind projects are moved offshore, and that's the development of the offshore wind industry. But also at the same time, we do now notice that the nuclear power option is receiving more attention from policymakers. It actually does have some traction now, some real traction, while previously it was not even considered at all. So in 2021, we did a study for the ECR group. It was led by Roos, who actually sponsored this study through the ECR group, and the Renew group was also involved. There was a Czech member of parliament that stood behind it. Several Czech members of parliament actually sponsored this study. So this study focused, among other things, on the question around spatial requirements for wind energy, wind and solar, that is. So the basic question we had to answer was how much land/space is required if wind and solar energy is used to provide all electricity by the year 2050 in the Netherlands and the Czech Republic. And of course, these types of questions are a little bit specific to the country you're talking about, because the possibilities for the technical possibilities for wind power differ quite significantly among various geographies. Next slide, please. So we developed a model that looks at the reliable estimates for total energy demand in the year 2050. And we projected that into the future and then came up with a specific energy demand for each of the two countries that we used to compute how much wind power was required and how much space, therefore, how much land would be needed to allow those wind turbines to operate. We did assume that the current state of technologies would be the same in 2050, and we also looked only at proven capacities, not at pie-in-the-sky promises made by the producers of wind turbines. So we based ourselves on what we know is possible now, and we based ourselves on what we know the capacity really is. We did look at plausible future innovations to some extent, but it was addressed more in a qualitative fashion in some of the comments. We did distinguish between wind at sea, wind on land, and wind on surface waters, because they each have their own specific requirements. And obviously, they also differ in terms of the amount of land versus the amount of water they would sort of occupy. And then we computed the maximum amount of surface of the land and space that would be available for wind and solar power, given the current regulatory and technical restrictions. You cannot place wind turbines everywhere, that's quite clear. For instance, here in the city of Brussels, you couldn't start building wind turbines. So we basically looked at what land would, in theory, be available to construct wind farms. Next slide, please. So findings for the Netherlands, we found that the space required to provide the energy demand in 2050, which is 3,000 petajoule, if you were to do that only by using wind and solar power, the space required would range from somewhere between 24,000 to 68,000 square kilometers. And to put it in perspective, 68,000 square kilometers corresponds to 1.8 times the entire territory of the Netherlands. In other words, the Netherlands, only to provide the power for its own people, would have to go outside its own territory to do that, which means it would have to go out on the North Sea, further out, or something like that, or start importing power, of course, which other nations would also have to do if they follow the same route. So that would definitely cause issues. Now, if you then compare to how much space, how much land you would need to produce the same amount of energy by nuclear power, you would see that you only need 120 square kilometers. So the difference there is quite huge. It's at least 260 times more if you are talking about offshore wind, and then we're talking only about the offshore wind close to the coast, not far out. Or you would need up to 534 times more land than nuclear to generate the same amount of energy. Next slide, please. The findings for the Czech Republic were as follows. The total energy demand required in 2050 was 1,800 petajoule. If you then use wind and solar to provide for that amount of energy, you would need between 14 and 43,000 square kilometers, which would cover between 18 and 55% of the Czech Republic's available land. So you can see that also in the Czech Republic, it's a huge amount of land that would be needed to provide for the space that is required by the wind industry if they are the ones that provide the entire energy supply. If you then compare to how much you would need to produce the same amount of energy using nuclear energy, you would conclude that you only need 269 square kilometers. So wind energy requires at least 54 times more land, but it could be even up to 160 times more land. Next slide, please. Now, in the study, we have treated the wind industry quite favorably. We have not done anything to sort of manipulate the data in favor of nuclear. We have in fact done quite the opposite. And there are a number of reasons why, in reality, the space requirements imposed by the wind industry will be even more demanding. For instance, what we did not include is the land that is required for the mining of and the production of the materials, the resources you need to produce the wind turbines, to install them and so forth. And those are quite significant. They're not included in these estimates. So we left all the downstream industry, we left it outside of the scope of this study. And of course, if you compare that to uranium mining or mining of other materials that can be used in the nuclear industry, you will see that there is quite a significant difference. It's much, much less than you would need in terms of mining and production when compared to wind. We also didn't look at the land needed for disposal of the waste. We all know that wind turbines have a limited lifespan, much shorter than the nuclear plants. Nuclear plants can go on 60, 70, 80 years and beyond that. But wind turbines, due to the enormous stress that is put on the turbines themselves, will have to be retired much quicker at a much faster rate. And then you end up with a lot of waste, and you need to dispose of the waste. You can of course recycle the metal compounds. The big problem, but you need recycling operations, and they take up land as well. But the big problem will be the disposal of the recycling rather of the blades. The blades are difficult to recycle because of the material they are made of, and that problem has not yet been solved, at least not satisfactorily. We also did not include the land that is required for the backup. Of course, the wind power creates the issue of intermittency. The wind doesn't always blow. And if the wind doesn't blow, you still need power. So where does the power come from? Well, you need a backup system. And the backup system, if you don't include nuclear in your backup, it will be based currently on either biomass, which has its own problems, which we will not talk about today, but they're also not insignificant, or you will have to rely on fossil fuels, which are in fact the one thing that the EU has said it wants to avoid. So that's a big problem, the land required for the backup power. We're also going to see that the best locations for wind power have already been taken up. So we've already used up all the best places to generate wind power, wind electricity. And going forward, the locations will be less efficient. And that obviously is going to have its own implications as well. If it's less efficient, you're going to produce less. You're going to need more wind turbines to produce the same amount of energy, which will further decrease the efficiency of the wind industry. Then further, we have the issue of the distance to the place where the energy is used. That distance will have to increase if you want to avoid annoying people too much, of harming human health or harming nature too much. You're going to have to move those wind farms to places that are quite distant from the coast, for instance, way offshore. But that will also mean that you're going to have more losses as a result of the distance, the transmission of the power between the place where it's generated and the place where it is used increases, as a result of which you'll have more losses. And then what we didn't take into account is the sort of 3D aspect here, the three-dimensional aspect. We looked only at the projection of the space taken up, projected on the land surface. So we only looked in square kilometers. We did not consider the issue of 3D. Again, their wind turbines are much less attractive than nuclear power. Nuclear power doesn't raise that problem at all, but with a taller wind farm, taller wind turbines, you're going to end up higher up and taking up more space higher up in the air, which will then translate into issues around. Yes, so I'm gonna finish up. My conclusions are quite clear. The conclusions of the study are quite clear. It's actually available. Next slide, please. It's actually available on the website. On a website, it's called The Road to EU Climate Neutrality by 2020. There is a website at roadtoclimateneutrality.eu where you can download the study. And Roos just showed you the full report. This is only the summary of the report. It's already 50 pages. The full report is quite a lengthy document. But basically, the conclusion of the entire report could be summarized in one sentence, which you will find in the report. And I'll read it out to you, and then I'll stop. While nuclear power requires a tiny bit of land to provide a whole lot of power at low cost, wind and solar require a whole lot of land to produce a tiny bit of power at high cost. And that's, I think, the important distinction between the two types of technologies. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lucas. Yeah, that's also very clear. We have time now for questions. We don't have very much time. We started some later, but let's try to stay within the time. I will give the floor to everyone, but before I first want to ask a question to all of the panelists. My first question to Professor Per Hansen, of Dr. Per Hansen is, Dr. Hansen, what do you think? Now we have only installed 16 gigawatt of wind power at sea, but the European Commission wants to go to 450 gigawatt at sea. What will be the effect for? Well, you are specialized in birds, but let's say the biodiversity. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes. I think it's it's not enough. Also, it's not. You have to make a lot of more investigations in order to know if that is even possible. I doubt it's possible. I think there is enough high pressure on the environment right now, both on land and more at sea. So I doubt there will be possibility. I think it's orimligt in Swedish, unreasonable. It's too high.
for the
They have to. It's impossible to use so much area for this vision.
Can I conclude that it has much consequences for biodiversity?
Yes.
It should be a concern of the European Commission.
It's already about 100,000 power plants right now are already making problem.
Okay.
So
Well, they want to increase it 30 times.
yes,
This is what's incredible.
It's way too much.
Thank you so much. Then I have a question for Professor Schrum. Is he still online? Oh, very good. Professor Schrum, what do you think? We spoke about the wind industry as a renewable. My question is it renewable? Thank you.
Yes, it's a matter of space. I mean, of course, it's not coming from nowhere, but it is a question of how you get the energy to the sea surface, but it's taken from somewhere. It is perhaps renewable at the sea surface or at the height where you take it out, but it has a spatial dimension. But overall, of course, it is not an endless resource.
Thank you so much. And then my question to Professor Bergkamp. People are telling us here in the parliament that wind energy is free of cost because there was always wind. How do you look at that?
Yeah, that's probably the only thing that is free about wind power. It's only the wind that's free. Everything else is very, very expensive. And when I use the word expensive, I don't mean only the economic cost, but as we've discussed already today, there's a lot of sort of non-economic cost, non-monetary cost involved with wind power as well. The aesthetics of it are not appreciated by many people, although some people claim they like to see wind turbines. The effect on birds, bats, insects, the effects on marine life, as we've heard today, the amount of space that's taken up that cannot be used for other purposes or only for limited other purposes. And then quite separately, you have the issue around the economic cost, and the economic cost of wind power will be astronomical because of the fact that you still need to keep a full backup system in place. You cannot say we're going to get rid of our backup. The EU, of course, tries to suggest that can be eliminated to a large extent because they feel that everything should now be put on hydrogen and similar options. Well, we all know that hydrogen sort of poses some of the same issues as wind energy in terms of the density and so on, and the amount of energy that can be stored in it and can be extracted from it. So that will probably not be the solution. In other words, yes, the cost of wind energy is very high, except for the fact that wind is free. So if you compare that to nuclear, where indeed uranium, for instance, is going to cost you a little bit, but then everything else comes at very low cost. So the total cost of these systems, of the two systems compared, you will conclude, if you do that in a reasonably objective fashion, that nuclear power is much more attractive than wind power.
Thank you so much. Then I will give the floor to the people over here. Is there anyone who wants to raise a question? I cannot see your name, but the floor is yours.
I have a question for Professor Bergkamp. In economics, when we're talking about strategy and investments and so on, we're always talking about switching costs and also limitations of entering a market as a new player and so on. Now, do you have any idea about the switching cost that the move towards renewables will have on the economy? Maybe specifically on the energy companies, but more in general on the economies of the countries involved.
Yeah, that's a good question, and you're quite right that there will be transition costs involved in moving to a new energy system. The problem there that I see is it all depends on how you do it. If you say, well, we're going to keep the full backup system in place all the time, so we will not have a problem of any blackouts in our system. That's, of course, important to know. Energy security, power security is very important to industry, to investment, and so on. So if you can guarantee the power security, the main issue then that you have to deal with is the question around cost. Can you keep the cost sufficiently down so that investing in Europe will remain attractive? And I think that's where the main problem arises. It doesn't look like we're able to do it. So in other words, it looks like the transition cost will be very high because basically it will mean that you will have significant deindustrialization throughout Europe.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. My name is Beatrice Timgren from Sweden, and I have a question. We have noticed that the wind turbines cause birds painful way, and we have also seen that it's affect the environmental. And the fishermen also report that the fish disappear from this area. And my question, Professor Scherm, do you also observe that the fish disappear? And do you have some theories why they disappear from this kind of area? Thank you.
The question is to Professor Schramm.
Yes.
Is she still online?
Now I can speak. I didn't have the right to speak. Not in that generality. There are species which seem to be attracted by the wind farms, and there are species which disappear. So it's a change in the structure of the food web. So it's not only adverse effects, but there are also for some species beneficial effects. So it's a little bit more complicated in that sense. But when you look into causes, of course, we are just in the beginning of this kind of research, but there are structural changes in primary production, and that gives the let's say the input to the ecosystem. And we see areas where production increase, but we also see areas where production decrease. And as a consequence, you will also see the changes in the food web in the upper trophic level. It is a disturbance, but it's not resulting in an overall decrease of primary production if you look at that for the entire sea.
Thank you so much, Professor Schramm. I suggest that we have one more question, and then it's time to go to the next panel. The gentleman on the other side.
I have a question for Dr. Per Hansson.
Can you introduce yourself?
I'm Timothy. I'm from Sweden also, yeah. And my question is, how did the environmental NGOs react to your research about bottleneck sites for threatened raptors? And have you been invited to elucidate these findings? And if so, what do you think the reasons might be?
Okay, thank you. Well, I think I mentioned something about it, but I can repeat that I have not been especially invited to the bigger environmental NGOs. I think they believe much in wind power. They like wind power, so they avoid things that could be negative. So, and my findings actually, I don't think they are much negative. I think it's a cost-effective way of protecting some areas and leaving others for wind and other energy sources. So, yeah, maybe that's a longer answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a short question and a short answer. That's very good. If there is one more question, I think we can do it. Otherwise, one more question, and then that's the last one.
My name is Outremont from Belgium. Why is it so that we are in this situation for many years now, that there are serious doubts about renewable energies, but nobody listens, or at least very few people listen? It's because of the fact that the renewable energy policy is based on two fears. fears of nuclear energy and fears of climate. And fears are things that you do not change easily. And as the European Commission and the European world, political world keeps pushing, telling people that if the European policy on renewable is not executed, we are heading against these two fears, I think we are in a very difficult fight. Now, how to address these fears, I do not know.
And do you also have a question?
I beg your pardon?
Do you have also a question for the panelists?
Well, I think it's both of you, Professor. You have not been listened to by, simply because you are. It's easy to answer that you are not the right person because fears are stronger than facts.
Yes, I agree. It's a very interesting thought and hypothesis that there is fear in the back, and we don't think when we are scared. We don't think good, so we should try. I don't know how, but I agree with you. We should avoid being scared. And
the issue around the exploitation of fear and the extent to which political and economic interests will utilize fear to achieve other objectives. And that's, I think, what we currently see, that there are entrenched interests, vested interests in expanding wind industry, for instance, because you can make money, you can gain political power, and also achieve political agendas to the extent that there are other agendas that are advanced by the wind industry. For instance, an agenda that looks at degrowth, which is something that this parliament, many parties would in fact endorse, degrowth. Well, wind industry is probably a good thing, and that will advance also the degrowth agenda. And once you start thinking along those lines, then fear is something to be exploited to pursue this other agenda. And I think that's what we currently see, that you have a mix of sort of fear in the general public, but also exploitation of the fear by political and economic interests.
Well, thank you so much. That with this, we come to the end of this panel. I want to ask you to give a warm applause to the panelists for their great view. And from here, I want to give the floor to my colleague, Mrs. Anna Zalewska. The floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Dzień dobry.
Good morning. I'm going to be speaking in Polish this morning, so I'd like to invite you to put your headphones on. First of all, thank you for inviting me here today. And I'd like to, first of all, present those who are going to be part of the panel I'm leading. There are a few people here around me. There's Mr. Fabien Ferreri. I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name. He is the head of an environmental association who will be telling us what it's like living near 5 wind turbines. We also have fishermen from Holland, dear Krakenjobschot, and Mr. Rasmussen. We'll be focusing on the social feelings around the location of wind farms. Now, why am I leading this panel? Well, because in Poland, for 6 years, I was at the forefront of a group made up of 1,200,000 citizens who were absolutely against the creation of wind farms in front of their houses. The wind turbine lobbyists were very aggressive, and they used huge amounts of money to buy over large parts of society. There were a few people in each village that held secret information, and then other people would find out that 17 or 20 wind turbines would be set up in a place without them being consulted at all. So after the change of governments, although I was Minister of Education at the time, I also fought against the creation of these wind turbines, faced with the huge hysteria of the wind lobbies. And luckily, things changed for the better in Poland, But now things, and so we have a law that says that these wind turbines have to be at least 700 meters away from someone's house. So that's a condition sine qua non for their creation. And I'm also part of a commission that supervises what's happening with renewable energies. And I must say that in Franz Timmerton's political bureau, that in that office there were lobbyists from the wind industry, and some regulations were just echoing the lobbyist points of views at the European Commission. We have documents that want to push for we want wind turbines to be infrastructures for humans' benefit. They will be used in the same way as highways are, for example, so that they can be placed where people want there to be. And they, of course, if sometimes they will have to pay certain fines for building them in the wrong places. We want legal regulations that will govern all of this. And I also like to say that a lot of so-called green investments are a form of greenwashing, because the production of wind turbines creates a huge emissions of CO2, starting from the concrete foundations to the steel constructions that are obviously built with coal. And then the creation of the blades and the rotors also are linked to huge ecological impacts. And of course, no one wants to face these issues from an ecological point of view. There are petitions sent to the Commission from the European Parliament. And we always ask the Commission or the environmental agency, the European Environment Agency, to paint an objective picture of what the real costs are and what the situation is with CO2 emissions. The gains made by the energy production of a wind turbine cannot compensate for the CO2 that's created by the creation of the production of the turbine in the first place. That's the reality. And also there's this we have to see the fact that wind turbines get everything for free. They get facilities into being connected into the grid. They get different certificates. There are lots of facilities for them obtaining credits and tax reductions. They get facilities to get credits from banks. And in each member country, this form of energy is promoted. It's a completely dysfunctional position when it comes to keeping an even playing field in the economy. And this, of course, leads to huge emotions, especially among society, which, first of all, would like to see objective analysis in all this noise. Of course, there are studies that are done, but we want this to be done at the European Environment Office. But I also don't know if you realize that there's a big drama in Europe, and that's that no one's studying groundwater, which is also something that really affects the environment and our soils. There's a problem with water. And so this is a huge challenge that we're faced with. So, it's enough to say that, for example, that the European Commission challenged Germany because Germany had not respected environmental directives. They hadn't created the Natura 2000 areas because of investing too much into such things, among other things, as renewable energy. Despite appearances, a lot of these initiatives do not help biodiversity. So I'm sure that our panelists will be telling us about all these different elements, and they'll tell us about what it's like living with these turbines and what are the different problems. All the different problems linked to the natural landscape, to peace and quiet, to their daily lives, to all these different issues that they have to deal with in the member countries or at the European level. So maybe we'll start with Mr. Fabien Ferreri.
Dobrze wypowiadam.
Did I pronounce your name well?
Oh.
Monsieur Roos, Madame Zalewska.
Mr. Roos, Ms. Zalewska, parliamentarians.
Of this invitation to this conference, which will allow me to discuss the consequence of installation of 5 wind turbines between my home in the French village of Échauffour in Normandy. If you allow me, I will express myself in French because I do not master the technical subtleties of the English language on this particular subject, where even more than elsewhere, I think the devil is in the details. Alors,
so first of all, I wanted to say that the case of the noise of the wind farm where I live isn't a single case. This has been noted all over France and the world as well. Échauffour has just been in the media far more, and it has actually seen the stopping of creating a wind farm by the authorities. I'm Fabien Ferreri. I was born a few years ago in Paris. I've always lived in large cities. I worked abroad as well. I worked in the cinema. So I wouldn't say that noise is an old friend, but it's an old acquaintance. A few years ago, 8 years ago, after the terrorist attacks, including the one at the Bataclan, my wife and I decided to leave Paris and to go live in the countryside. And we chose this village in Normandy. It's a small village with 740 inhabitants, and some of the most famous trotting horses are born there. This is a very well-preserved environment. We live in a property of 2.5 hectares, and you still find species of insects which have disappeared from most of Normandy, so it's a very well-preserved area. Our decision was dictated by wanting a different rhythm of life. We wanted to have an experience of real environmental engagement and being away from these urban areas. So we made some professional decisions that allowed us to live this life. When we arrived in Échauffour, it was around 2015, I believe, we knew that the Échauffour Énergie company, which is a subsidiary of Voltalia from the Mulliez group, which you all know, I'm sure, they had acquired 6 building permits for the installation of 5 wind turbines and a delivery station in March 2013. This project had always been supported by the farmers in our community, especially those who were close to the municipal council, but it was fought strongly by an association, a group, and we felt that this project wouldn't go through when we moved there. But my wife and I really trusted our municipal authorities and those of our prefecture and those of our French state as well, of course, to control the installation of this machinery if it were to go forward. And we were wrong, actually. The 5 turbines, I'll just quickly give you some technical details. They are Senvion MM100. They're around 95 meters tall, 140 meters at the end of the blade, and they have an individual nominal power of 2.05 megawatts. They were put into service in spring 2019, before the court decision was handed down to authorize them. Since this moment, most of the residents living in a perimeter of 1,500 meters of this site have dealt with very violent noise pollution linked to these machines. At my home, the noise could only be heard in periods when the wind blew in our direction. But when the noise did start, we would be woken up 30 times a night. We couldn't leave our house. We couldn't be outside. And I've always lived with noise. I slept tonight in Brussels next to Midi, and actually slept better around Midi here than in my town in Échauffour with the turbines going. What we felt was that the noise and the vibration of the rooms really motivated us to fight against this on social media, and our individual rights were very important. I sent complaints, I sent emails to political groups, local groups, journalistic groups, our elected members of state. I sent letters to the President of the Republic as well. And I had time because, as I said, I was woken up all the time at night, so I had all the time in the world to write these emails. And finally, I was heard. At the request of the Laon Prefecture and the area of Normandy, different acoustic measurements were implemented, and they showed a lack of conformity with noise regulations at different parts of the site, regardless of fail-safe plans. During a third acoustic measurement campaign led by the company, the group lost a month of data from the most critical period of the measurement. We were able to prove that this data loss was purposeful because the microphones send the data every 5 minutes, so it's very difficult to lose data in those circumstances. We were also able to prove a manipulation of data, and this was approved by the prefectures. To avoid the problems of non-conformity, we wanted to have an extraordinary suspension, and it was the first time that such a suspension was put in place, and they stopped the wind farm's operations. So this was a partial and temporary stop to the activities at night from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. And this happened on the 12th of March 2021. The objective of the third-party experts was to analyze the reliability of the acoustic reports established by the operator and service providers. We wanted to carry out additional measures to allow the operator to define a clamping plan which would be in accordance with the regulatory requirements. And the deadline for all of this was 5 months after the partial stopping was implemented. However, this was supposed to be an impartial group, a neutral group, but one of the experts was head of the Gamba Acoustic Group, which is a very well-known expert group, and he mentioned some very strong, the fact that he had this position raised some very strong criticism from acoustic experts, and also from all the people who worked in government who met this man, because it turns out that this Mr. Garrigue, who was one of the major architects of a controversial method of measuring wind noise, which was then imposed by ministerial decree, and it was applied to all sorts of commissioned studies of wind turbines. And this measuring system was called, the draft name of it was PRNFS 31114, and this actually denies characteristics of wind noise, and it doesn't protect people, but it seems to want to allow this noise to carry on where people live. And this gentleman was also the host of a group called FNOR, and they had a noise in the Environment Commission, and they were supposed to measure wind farm noise. And he was he really wanted to defend the wind industry, and so the commission that he was part of was actually dissolved. This commission was imposed from on high. and it excluded representatives of the actual citizens. They ended up handing down a protocol on the 31st of March 2022. This was a unilateral decision where they published a new protocol of wind noise measurement, and this was imposed on all French citizens. I specified that we launched a request to annul this new protocol, and we received a memo as a reply, so we're now creating a response to that, and we're hoping that this new protocol will be cancelled because it wasn't created in the correct circumstances. In short, all of our remarks, which were documented on the lack of legitimacy of this third expert, were swept away by the Orne Prefecture. The closing meeting of the third expert opinion was held in July 2022. There was a commission to follow the wind farm, but these noises and the vibrations continue where I live, but these have now been decided as within regulations. And the cause is this unilateral French modification of the regulations on the measurement of wind noise, which was, again, granted in suspicious circumstances. The desire to deploy these machines by releasing regulatory constraints has led us to an aberration. We're sacrificing the environment, the health and heritage of local populations to supposedly preserve those same values. And more seriously, French legislation on wind noise has introduced a very dangerous modification of the idea of noise, which is now just an indicator established on the basis of statistical medians. And medians, if you think about a distribution of values, you only keep the central values, so you remove the highest and lowest values. And this indicator is completely separate from the real problems that it causes. It has nothing to do anymore with public health criteria. So I think if we accept this dangerous deviation, it might become generalized, and it might become be applied for any installation which is supposed to protect the environment. It can also apply to any neighborhood noise, and it would really change the definition itself of noise in an environment where people live. I'm lucky enough to be hosted by you here, and we signed a petition which was presented here in Parliament, and we're waiting for our members of Parliament to start an initiative and for Parliament to speak on this matter. I think this is urgent for all of us, so thank you for listening.
Thank you much for your very important history. And next speakers, Dirk Craig and Job Scott.
Hello, I'm Job Scott. I will keep my speech in Dutch, so take your headphones.
First of all, Rob Roos, thank you for giving us a platform to have our voices heard. I'm Job Scott. I come from a long line of fishermen. I've been on the sea for over 20 years. I've lived through all sorts of environmental situations, and we always say that in my family we don't have blood in our veins but salt water. So I really speak as an expert, and over the last 32 years we've seen a lot of changes, especially over the past 10 years. This is our third meeting in the European Parliament, and every time the problem comes up, but what has changed? Nothing. And that's a big problem. I'll read my speech now.
Ik ben gestopt met mijn bedrijf.
I stopped my company 3 weeks ago for a number of reasons. And one of them is offshore wind energy. This is a big problem for the fishery industry. The industrialization of the North Sea have a lot of consequences for marine life, including fish. And we are noticing this as fishers, and reports are agreeing with us. This isn't all positive wind energy. All sorts of animals are disappearing, and oysters, for example, mussels, these are the canaries in the coal mine, so to speak. Wind turbines don't have a home in our North Sea. This is where we get our fish from, and we are never consulted when it comes to these matters. Coexistence is used very often. It's a word that's used very often, but in practice it's not carried out. Fisheries are accused of threatening biodiversity, and different areas are closed to fisheries, and then wind turbines are put in those zones. What about biodiversity? The wind industry creates hundreds of wind parks, and the turbines will dig deep into the sea, into the ground in the sea, and this also threatens biodiversity in that area, of course. My neighbor said that there's no controlling these issues. In the fisheries, for example, we are controlled constantly or monitored constantly, and there is no monitoring when it comes to the setting up of these wind farms. So wild-caught fish are being threatened, and our food supply is threatened, which means that the consumer can no longer get wild-caught fish. And this is our fish, and it has the lowest ecological footprint. It doesn't need to be modified with pesticides. Our fish is full of omega-3 fats. It's very healthy for you. And our fish creates jobs for all the fishers on the sea. And for every fisherman, you have 3 or 4 people who have other jobs related to them. So the issues created by offshore wind energy are as follows. First of all, there are many, you need a lot of power to set up these turbines, and it creates very loud noises which can kill fish or make them deaf. The noise created by these turbines can be felt for a very long distance as well, which means that the fish are scared away from these areas. There's also the electromagnetic waves, which will disturb a fish when they are migrating, and we have prawns, for example, who are not migrating from their usual spot on the American coast because they are scared away from our seas due to the wind farms, and we're actually seeing a 50% decrease in these animals in our zones. The water is mixed by the blades, and this also creates problems for the local fauna. North Sea is the most populous sea, where we have the most wind farms, which means that if there's a lack of communication, then it's very easy to have a disaster where boats can hit the turbines, for example. We've also got metals floating off the turbines, which will poison the local waters. We also realize that there are climate changes. We are catching different fish compared to earlier. As a sector, we also know that there is a need for an energy transition, but offshore wind turbines are not a solution. As fishers, we've had it explained to us that we need to keep the ecosystem healthy, but my colleagues and myself notice that the wind farms are a threat to this biodiversity. And in the future, over 30% of the North Sea will be occupied by these farms. 30% more will be closed to us. 10 to 15% will be forbidden zones. And so we are being pushed into a small reservation like Native Americans. Due to the close off of the South Sea, we were protected. When I was a small child, my father would say that we would catch small fish from the South Delta. This was it was great that there were so many children because there were so many fish, because actually the South Delta was like a nursery for them, and this whole ecosystem has been destroyed, and this was due to human intervention. Shouldn't we be collaborating with nature? This is a very sensitive ecosystem. There's a lot of biodiversity with a lot of potential for dynamic productivity. We don't want to make this an industry, and the so-called green transition seems to not be very green at all when we see the consequences it has. We want our members of parliament to stop the creation of these offshore wind farms without first having a full assessment of the negative impacts on the ecosystem. We want to respect the historical fishing zones of our fishers, and we need the fishers to be compensated for the loss of their catches, and ports that already exist need to be respected, and large wind farms haven't been studied in terms of the effects they have. There is a 1989 Convention for the Protection of Marine Biodiversity, and it says that any new activity can't be a burden for local ecosystem, and this is being neglected for the creation of the wind farms. The report of Peter van Dal from 2019 which is about marine spatial planning and fisheries, must be taken into consideration. Preventative measures need to be taken to stop the impact on the ocean ecosystem. Food security from our northern seas is a matter of law, and it needs to be upheld by the authorities. Positive results from the fishers who want to create sustainable fisheries need to be privileged over the creation of these wind parks. We need to protect the sea. The sea is a source of good food and of life. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And next, Mr. Dan Rasmussen.
Thank you very much. Good day, everyone. Enchanté, or dzień dobry to my Polish friends. My name is Dan Rasmussen, and I serve as the oppositional counsel in a region in northern Sweden called Västernorrland. And believe it or not, despite many maps cutting EU cutting Sweden in half, there is actually a Sweden north of Stockholm as well. So be advised of that. Next slide, please. Yeah. The EU's influence on local governance and national decision-making can often present significant challenges for local politicians like myself. While the EU aims to harmonize laws and create cohesion among its member states, it can lead to a loss of local autonomy. We constantly need to face the struggle of trying to balance the desires and needs of our constituents and local residents with the directives and regulations imposed on us by the European Union, among others. One of the major challenges that I encounter is the issue of excessive centralization and micromanagement by the EU. While the intention is to create uniform policies, it can hinder the decision-making process at the local level. And the dream world of having a one-size-fits-all system, which the EU often demands, often produces more hindrance than gains. And as a representative of my community, I am acutely aware of the unique circumstances and needs of my constituents. However, the top-down approach of the EU often overlooks these nuances, which makes it difficult to effectively serve the best interest of my local residents. And let's not forget how these directives can go directly against the nation's self-determination rights and the right to self-governance by the local politicians. Next slide, please. I have witnessed the impact wind power has on local communities. And while wind power is often touted as a clean and renewable energy source, it's not without its drawbacks, as we've heard today. And one of the significant challenges that I face is witnessing how wind power projects can tear communities apart. The residents of Örnsköldsvik in Västernorrland are rare exceptions to this, where they have been fighting together against the production of a huge wind power industry for almost 10 years now. And they're very resilient, and I actually admire their tenacity to keep fighting. This is, after all, a David versus Goliath battle. When ordinary people question the viability or impact of wind power, they often find themselves at a huge disadvantage due to their limited experience and resources. Unlike the large corporations driving the wind power industry forward, these individuals may not have access to judicial help or the financial means to oppose wind power locally. Large corporations in the wind power industry possess considerable influence and resources, and that can be very intimidating for the individuals seeking to voice their legitimate concerns. These companies have extensive network, they have lobbying power, and they have financial backing, making it difficult for these ordinary people to compete on an equal playing field. The asymmetry of power can discourage individuals from challenging wind power at all, fearing the potential consequence or backlash that they may face locally. However, the most concerning that I can see is the impact it has on property values. The mere discussion of wind power turbines locally decreases the values of your homes, which make them more challenging to sell or even to refinance and renovate. This fact also creates friction between the landowners, who sometimes don't even live in the area themselves, who can see this as an economic opportunity to have wind power turbines on their land, and the local community, who face the financial losses as well as losses to their social well-being. In Sweden, we have actually an appropriation law where you can sell your residence for 125% of market value when people are making wind power really close, so you can't have your home anymore. But the problem with that is, when do you assess how much the property is worth? Because 125% of €0 is still €0. So the lack of transparency can further deepen the divide within the community and the local authorities. And some residents may feel, and rightfully I may add, that their concerns are being sometimes disregarded in favor of meeting these so-called renewable energy targets set by the EU or national governments. And in those moments, I would like to remind everyone for whom we actually are supposed to be serving. Yeah. Next slide. When it comes to wind power specifically, there are already rules and guidelines to follow in Sweden. First and foremost, it is the operator, that is the company responsible for dismantling of the wind power turbines when they are no longer in power, so to speak. Then the responsibility goes to the landowner, and lastly to the public, regions and municipalities to provide for the dismantling of the wind power turbines. And the risk with this is that if the company that owns the wind industry realize that their wind turbines are about to no longer be effective, they can go bankrupt. And then if the landowners cannot dismantle the facility, that means that all the costs will end up with the municipalities, regions, or municipal associations in Sweden. And we're all aware of the situation in Denmark where decommissioned wind turbines stand as steel skeletons in the landscape. Chapter 16, Section 3 of the Environmental Code in Sweden mentions that the state, regions, and municipal associations are not required to ask for economic securities when it comes to wind power. This means that in cases where the municipality is governed by politicians who are blinded by ideological climate and energy hysteria, they can potentially be exploited and let the local residents instead bear all the cost of dismantling these facilities and restoring the land to its original state. So how can we combat that in Sweden, for example? Well, that we can do by revising the environmental code, of course. I'm proposing, for example, the introduction of a mandatory scrappage premium during the construction of new wind power installations for a party conference. And this scrappage premium means that the producer must pay a security deposit to the regions and municipalities that correspond to the cost of dismantling the facilities, and pay for land restoration and other environmental exploitation costs that may arise already during the establishment of new wind power. Regarding nuclear power, there is already a similar requirement in Sweden to deposit financial securities into a fund. So why not also have it regarding wind power, so they follow the same premise as nuclear power? I would recommend everyone actually to take that information home with you so you don't face similar challenges as Sweden does with its very rigid environmental code. So to conclude a little bit, I would like to say that the struggle of everyday people who question or challenge wind power highlights the inherent inequalities in the renewable energy landscape. Limited expertise and resources, the need to balance everyday life, the influence of large corporations, and the emotional toll all contribute to the uphill battle facing the local residents. Recognizing and addressing these challenges is crucial for fostering a more inclusive and democratic dialogue around renewable energy. By amplifying these voices of those who may lack specialized knowledge but have valid concerns, a more nuanced and honest approach to wind power can be achieved. It is through this balanced approach that we can truly create a world that is environmentally conscious, socially accountable, and economically prosperous. And in the last slide that I have here up, I will leave my name and email on the display if anyone would have a question to me after the event as well. After all, dialogue is the first step towards making meaningful progress. Thank you for listening, and remember, there is a Sweden north of Stockholm as well.
Thank you very much. And we have timing for questions.
Can I ask you? Yes. Well, I have a question for our fisherman Job. I will do it in Dutch, so you need a translation. Job, je had het over...
Job, you mentioned new users as fishers. You've been busy for centuries. Your father, your grandfather, you have generations in your own family using the North Sea as fishers. But now you're being defined as new users. What effect does this have? For me, the industries with the wind turbines are the new users. So how does this square? Yes, well, we thought that as the oldest users of the sea, we'd have the most rights. In 1989, the fishers received some fishers received the status of historic users, and it seems that some of my colleagues were sort of asleep at the wheel. But it seems that fishing in Natura zones, especially, can be complicated by the status of new user. It makes a big difference. If you're an old or legacy user, then you can continue working with your ships and with your different equipment. But if you're a new user, you need to fall within very strict guidelines. And for the offshore wind industry, there don't seem to be any restrictions at all. As new user or legacy user, that has no effect on the wind industry either. That's why I said that fishing is framed very strangely. The wind industry says, yes, well, the fishing industry is harmful, they create all these issues, while they themselves are creating so many problems around the wind parks. As you saw in the presentation from Professor Schrum, the deep sea setup changes completely because the setup of the waters changes very much. And I've spoken to English colleagues whether they can fish in their wind parks, and they say that the fishers of Ramsgate, where the wind farm is, they're not catching anything. And they are allowed to fish there, but they're not catching anything. And the ocean has changed so much due to the currents around the turbines that they are just losing all the fish in the area. And these effects aren't being monitored. We have trawling nets, of course, as most of our fisher colleagues. But if we want to fish this way with trawlers through the wind parks, then we are accused of doing harm. So we're being chased out of areas where we've always fished. For example, if you are sailing around the Belgian coast and you arrive in an area with no wind turbines, then you will still get a huge fine if you go over the if you go into a specific area which is claimed to be for a wind park, even if you can't see the turbines anywhere. I don't want to come across as a sort of alarmist, but this is our reality at sea currently. We're really being threatened.
Thank you. Any more questions? Please.
Yes,
I have a question for Mr. Ferreri. If I understood you correctly, there's been a whole infiltration into the French administration from the local government level all the way up to the central government. Is this an issue linked to technocracy itself? Or are they industrial conglomerates or other powers at play here? What is your opinion on this? I think I've got a problem with the word infiltration. It sounds a bit like a conspiracy, and I don't really want to take position on that issue. But what you need to know is that there is an organization called the Franco-German Office. I think it's called, the acronym I think is OFAT. And this is a body that really promotes this energy. And its office is actually situated right opposite the Environment Ministry. And the lawyer that defends the minister comes from a large legal firm that is the legal firm that also defends the wind industry. So, of course, this is not forbidden by the legislation, but it does give us the impression that these forces are organized by people that see wind energy with a very good eye. And all these people working in these different commissions have been placed there to give the idea that there's a pluralistic system in place, but in the end people have been excluded. Lots of commissions were closed down. The AFNOR normalization committee's work has been abandoned, and the last protocol that was published was only published with the acoustic experts and the representatives of a wind industry. The other advisors were pushed out. They weren't allowed to work, and so actually a lot of them left of their own will because their work was basically abandoned. So if I understand things correctly, the access by citizens is discouraged, if I understand correctly. Well, you know, it's only logical that when the ministry publishes its decisions, they have to be submitted to public scrutiny for decision to be able to take place. And they were published online with in a confidential manner. They were kind of kept under a veil of secrecy. We found out that there were consultations going on, but there were around 500 contributions, but out of those 498 were against these draft decisions. And so because of this, the ministry did not take any of these into account. They were just swept under the carpet. The public is not taken into account in all these decisions. And just forgive me, one last thing. The ministry published these draft decisions, but the protocol was not published. We did not know what the protocol was. It was then afterwards pushed through.
I'm Doutremont from Belgium, but I'm also the porte-parole of the petition against wind noise, the petition to the European Parliament. This petition has been put to your attention on April 2021. We are still nowhere, quasi. This is exactly the answer to your question. Nothing happens. And why? And this is really serious. And when these two gentlemen have requested that there is progress made, at least because it's there for 2 years now, vis-à-vis this petition, I think it's important because the fact that there is no progress is the answer to all our questions. That very fact, and the fact is partly in responsibility, with the responsibility of the members of the parliament. We have to face it. We have to say it. This is your responsibility. We cannot do more than we do. Most of us are people who spend years of their life to bring to you the message that you have. We cannot do more.
Thank you very much. Please wear handphone. I speak Polish. Bardzo.
Thank you very much. I think we're all really on the same page here. I think we have the same assessment of the situation at hand. For us, politicians, for me personally, I've worked in this whole procedure in a large country of Central Europe, and from my point of view, I can say that it's not just a conspiracy, it's big money. People are being paid, and often the citizen is completely kept out of the picture. They don't have the means, the money to stand up to these interests. There are agreements that are made in secret, that are not that are done with concrete farmers, for example, they're done at the level of some specific local government with some specific elected officials who work on these decisions. There are consultations and decisions taken with various agencies. Huge sums of money is paid for getting absurd opinions, when actually anyone can publish such an opinion that will be accepted in this civil consultation process. This is something that happens at the level of ministries, at the European Commission. And I can talk about this because I was also targeted by these lobbies, that I was pushed to try and to make me stop dealing with these issues in Poland. So you're right. This is something that the European Parliament has to deal with. But these industries want to develop wind turbines even more. They want to have an even greater influence. And that's why there's different draft laws at place in order to have consultations that will not involve citizens' opinions. Now, we've managed to save certain things, but we've managed to protect ourselves from certain paragraphs that stated that wind turbines were actually healthy for humans. So that's something we managed to keep out of the laws. But the problem is that these issues will not disappear. They'll actually become more serious. Hopefully, we'll be able to launch a European Citizens Initiative. We need to gather 1 million signatures at EU level. And I don't think that's a problem, because I think there are many people that have been touched by this issue. Now, I don't want to speak instead of our president here, because they're the ones who are responsible of this, but I think we should try and do something in order to create a larger debate at the level of the European Commission, at the level of the Parliament, and we'll force the environmental bodies to ignore these petitions. I remember your petition because I took part in these meetings, especially whenever there was something that had something to do with renewable energies. But we don't have much time, because from April we'll stop functioning, really, because that's when the elections will start here. But perhaps during the moment of elections we'll be able to raise emotions, to make Europeans realize that this is not a piece of child's play, that this is serious discrimination of people's property, that it's a lack of respect of nature, all the while hidden under so-called protection of the environment. So thank you very much, and I'd really like to affirm my full commitment and support to your work and this initiative at European level. Thank you.
So then we will go to the next part, that is the finances. So now we're going to look at the numbers. And our first speaker is economy writer and journalist Jan Blomgren. Great experience of the wind energy industry and its procedures. She has been revealing the economy behind several of wind energy projects. She has been following the wind industry for decades. Already in 2009, she published the book, The Wind Power Scam, a story how the wind energy were about to fool a whole village in north of Sweden. So good.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you very much giving me the opportunity to show my experience from this industry. Next slide, please. That's me. Next slide, please. I'm now going to take you on a journey to the rural area of Sweden. That's far from the nice offices here in Brussels and from the nice desktops where you create all the ideas that you are going to apply on us on the local level. This is Kaxås in Jämtland. I would like you, it's situated between Åre and Östersund, and I would like you to pay attention to the hills in front of the snowy mountains. This is where I live. I live in the village in the end of the lake, but this is where the wind power industry for over a decade, different wind industries has been attacking us with the suggestions of building wind turbines that are almost today 300 meters of heights, and they would like them to place them on hills that are around 400, 500, 600 meters. So we are talking 1 kilometer up in the air. Next slide, please. So for over 14 years, we together in the village and in the area around, we have been defended our area and our beautiful view from the destruction from wind turbines. And so far, we have succeeded. But I will give you an example how it works and the conflicts of interest that comes along with this industry. In 2019, officials and politicians in our municipality, Krokoms kommun, they wanted to close down our village school. What I didn't know then, but what I know today, is that this is often how it starts when they introduce the wind power industry. You don't know anything about it, but they close down your local school because that's the strategy. They want to get rid of the people in the area. They want it to make it impossible to live there. And I've seen the pattern now after in other places. But thanks to the social entrepreneur Dan Olofsson and his family, we decided that we want to save the school. We want young people to come to us and live in our village and the villages around and take part of this beautiful nature that we have. So we started a project Kaxås, focusing on attracting young families from different parts of Europe and Sweden and the urban areas. Next slide, please. And so we did, and so we succeeded. We built 29 new nice houses with a beautiful view over the mountains and the lakes around the village. And we have attracted many families. We went from 100 residents to almost triple it to 300 residents in 4 years. I think that's very good. So there is a huge attraction for the living in the rural area in Sweden today. And we also succeeded to bring families to empty houses, 18 empty houses in the surroundings around the village, which before, it was houses that before the project were abandoned. Next picture, please. So these kids you see here are some of our new settlers, and they are going to go to the school in the future, and the school is saved for many years forward. But the thing is, the families that moved to us, they had made the biggest decision of their life. It's not easy to move people. And they are brave people. They have decided to move from friends and relatives, thousands of kilometers away from where they started their lives. So it's a very brave decision they made. And when we started this project, and we have been running it for 2 years, what we didn't know was at the same time, as an official at the authority in the municipality, was we needed their approval to build the houses, of course. So we applied for that, and we discussed with them and had a long dialogue. And we got approval for our plan, building the houses, and we attracted families. But the same person negotiated with Vattenfall to build the largest land-based wind industry in Sweden right around our whole residential area, both the new one and the old one, on the heights you saw in the first picture. And it was only by a coincidence we got to know, even though we had had this dialogue for a long time with the municipalities, authorities, and officials. So what happened was that we got this news from a landowner a private one. Of course, he was not living in Jämtland. He lived in Stockholm, and he inherited the land. So he saw, oh wow, I can make some money of my older generation's land that I still own in Jämtland and build and get the wind power there. So we got this news by him, and when you get that news, and you have attracted so many families that had made a life decision, it's very difficult for you. Now we can talk about sleepless nights. You can talk about stolen lives. And we had made a great investment in those young families as way to come to the village. And none of them, because we had to ask them, we didn't know, do you like wind power? Do you want to have wind turbines here? But no one wanted to have any wind turbines in the area. So their expectation of coming to us, to our rural area, was of course the untouched nature, the wonderful views, the quietness, the wildlife, the skiing. And of course, we are a great community with a lot of fun socially as well. And this is what happens when you are confronted with wind power. The value of the houses decreases 30% right away. It's not a decision taken that is going to be wind power, but from the start, when they started discussion, the value of the real estate decreases 30%. And that means that you can't get any loans, so you can't buy anything, you can't build anything. And what we needed to do in that situation we was in was that we had to make special agreements to those families so they would not suffer any financial damage due to this threat of wind power that came over us. And what we know is where the wind turbines, where they move in, people move out. Next picture. And more things happens if you even dare to oppose to this industry and its political patrons. You will pay a very, very high price for your resistance, and you will risk a lot of your life. You will get harassed, you may lose your job, and you will be exposed to a lot of hatred. The methods that are used by the industry and politicians is not democratic. You shouldn't treat your citizens this way. But this is a method because they want you to be quiet and they want to get you out of the community. And you have to be very brave and resilient to be able to stand up against this multi-industry with all this money. Next slide, please. And the things that is happening in Sweden right now is due to the massive spread of wind turbines in our rural areas all around the land. We are facing a complete destruction of our nature. Turbines affects the wildlife, we have heard it here, the bird life, we have heard it here, insects, and the biodiversity. Untouched views are lost forever. Forest transforms into stone deserts. And we can talk about thousands and thousands of hectares of forests that are completely destroyed and devastated. And unspoiled views, like you see here, when you can see and there's no wind power, it's become so rare due to this massive expansion of the wind industry. So the question is now raising whether we must be classified as a World Heritage Sites for future generations to come. Next slide, please. If the devastation continues for future generations, they will not be given the opportunity to understand the interaction between nature, animal life, and man, which is crucial for our existence on this planet. So next, the last slide. So summary, this is what I urge based on my experience, and that is we need to do more unbiased scientific studies, and we need to do analysis on the consequences, and they need to be done immediately. We need to put an end and stop right now to offshore and onshore wind power. And those residents, and there are many of them both in France and in Sweden, that are strongly affected financially by the industry, they must be compensated for the damage caused by the wind power industry so they can find a new life elsewhere. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Karin. The next speaker is Dr. John Constable, PhD, Cambridge University, Director of the Renewable Energy Foundation. John Constable is a one-time academic who now directs the Renewable Energy Foundation, a UK charity publishing a wide range of data and analysis on the energy sector. And I think he's online. Yeah. You have the floor.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to you. I've been asked to speak about the economics of wind installations, and my remarks are based on work that we published at Renewable Energy Foundation over the last decade, which is thoroughly empirical. However, I will start with some theoretical remarks, because these underpin the empirical results. We can see that empirically that wind is very expensive, but it's interesting to understand why that is the case, and we can see it quite straightforwardly with a theoretical perspective. Professor Bergkamp touched on the issue that wind is often regarded as free. Well, in fact, while true, so is the oil and the coal and the gas and the uranium in the ground. But there is an extraction, a conversion, and a delivery cost for all these fuels, wind, oil, coal, and gas. It happens, empirically we know it's true, that the extraction, conversion, and delivery costs for wind are extremely high per kilowatt hour as compared to conventional energy. And therefore the question arises, why is that so? Well, theory tells us quite clearly why that is so. It is the physical quality of wind energy that is the problem. The thermodynamic quality, in fact, its energy state. This is very poor quality energy. It's very close to random heat. But the energy required by consumers, as electricity, is of a very high quality, a very low entropy, whereas the wind is of very high entropy, it's chaotic. Clearly, a great deal of correction takes place between these two states, the poor quality of the wind as found in nature and the electricity that is supplied by consumers. And that is the clue to its cost. It's resource intensive. A great deal of correction is taking place to the wind. Indeed, you can regard much of the high quality that is delivered to consumers as actually supplied by the corrective mechanisms between these two states. And this is experienced by consumers as extremely high cost. To illustrate the poor quality of the wind, I will indicate only one fact about it. I'm not sure I'm the first person to publish this, but I have not heard it from others. There are no living organisms, absolutely none whatsoever, that derive their fundamental metabolic energy from wind. The organisms, of course, coast on wind, and plants use wind to disperse their seeds and pollen. But they do not derive their fundamental metabolic energy from wind. There is no way of making a living from wind. But nature is remarkable at finding a means of survival for living organisms. So this absence of life in wind is quite remarkable. Of course, there are living organisms that derive their fundamental metabolic energy from sun, plants, but I note that they themselves are rather simple and do not move or have complex civilizations to support. So much for theory. We can now see that there is a theoretical problem with wind, and indeed with sun, but that's a secondary issue here today. There's a fundamental problem with wind in theory. Empirically, we see extremely high capex, extremely high opex, and very high system costs in delivering the energy generated to consumers. Of course, the industry itself claims to have reduced its capex and opex, but empirical study of audited financial statements in Europe tells a quite different story. And you can find the results of this work in peer-reviewed papers in the literature and in major studies published by my own organization, Renewable Energy Foundation. We do not see significant reductions in CapEx, and we actually see OpEx, operational costs, maintenance costs, rising. System costs are extremely high. In the early 2000s in the UK, before we had much wind or sun, system costs, balancing costs that is, were around about £400 million per year. Last year, they were approximately £4,000 million, £4 billion. I can't say that all that increase, that staggering increase, is the result of wind and sun, but a very large part of it is. When you introduce stochastic generation, random generation, into a system, inevitably the costs are going to increase for the physical reason I've just indicated. The entropy of the wind flow is very high. The service required by consumers as electricity is a low entropy, it's very ordered, high quality, and therefore much correction must take place between these two states. And that's resource intensive, and that manifests itself as very high costs to consumers. Well, you may say, well, why on earth do people build wind turbines in the first place? Well, the answer, of course, is that they're heavily subsidized. And the subsidy comes in many different forms. Direct income support to investors, so that they get a return on capital. And these are very expensive devices. And as I say, their capex has not fallen significantly. The aggregate costs of subsidies to European consumers are of a considerable magnitude. I calculated from European Union data that between 2008 and 2021, the renewables industry, much of which was wind, had received somewhere in the region of 770 billion euros in income support from consumers and taxpayers. These are very large sums of money. And that is rising at roughly 60 billion euros a year. But there are many other subsidies to the industries, for example, avoided grid connection costs, and in fact that they don't pay for the integration costs, the system costs, that £4 billion a year in the UK alone, that they are imposing on the electricity system. So there are very high costs to consumers here. But it goes beyond this, and we must think about this in terms of a climate policy. Is this actually a sustainable or an economically compelling climate policy? And these extremely high costs, which, as I say, have physical groundings, manifest themselves in climate policy as a very high abatement cost. That is the cost of reducing a ton of carbon dioxide. Well, that cost turns out on examination to be very high in relation to an estimate of the harm caused by that ton of carbon dioxide. In other words, the social cost of carbon. Estimates of social cost of carbon vary considerably, but central estimates are around about $50 to $100 a ton. The US Environmental Protection Agency is currently arguing for what I think is a very high cost of about $190 a ton. But even at that very high US EPA cost, the abatement cost from renewables, and particularly offshore wind in Europe, particularly floating offshore wind, is going to be several times that. It's going to be very, very high. In other words, the cure being offered is actually worse than the disease, and therefore this is not an economically rational climate policy. And that's very important indeed. I mean, it's rational to have a climate policy. Let's be no doubt about that. But your climate policy must be rational, and ours simply isn't. In economic terms, it is quite clear that the cure is actually worse than the disease. People intuit this in various different ways. I mean, I've just displayed it to you in a technical fashion, but the man and woman in the street pick these things up in more general and intuitive terms, but they're not wrong to do so. We think about complex issues in all sorts of ways. And there will be pushback against this. People can see that this is not actually an environmentally wise or sustainable policy. So the conclusion is that for physical reasons, which we can see in theory, and empirical reasons, which we can see in fact from economic performance, the wind industry has been dramatically over-deployed. This is a niche technology, which might make sense for remote locations with batteries. It will never be cheap energy, but it might be the cheapest in a particular location. This is a niche technology which has been grotesquely overblown to the detriment both of consumers and indeed of the climate policy which it claims to support. However, the good news is that markets work, and these facts are increasingly known in the financial centers of the world, and there are organizations and institutions who are preparing shorting strategies on this industry. There's a huge market opportunity here to short the wind industry and to exercise market hygiene. I would prefer that this does not actually happen and that governments wind this down before much more capital is malinvested in this sector. We need to do this for the consumer interest and also in order to preserve and redesign our climate policies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jan Constable. Next speaker is Professor Jan Blomgren, that has a career as encompassed all aspects of nuclear technology, starting in research and education at a university, moving on to nuclear strategy and policy management in the corporate world, as well as business training for all levels of management. His present position is targeting top-level nuclear business management. He's an internationally recognized speaker, trainer, and advisor to companies, governments, and international organizations on nuclear business issues, and is author of the book Everything You Need to Know About Sweden's Electricity Supply.
Thank you, sir. Thanks, John Constable, for stealing all my talk. I can essentially underline everything that has been said, and I'm going to present you a few examples taken on top of my head. The title of this day is Wind Industry at What Cost? And I'm going to provide the answer, high and rising. We have spent enormous amounts of tax money in Europe to make all electricity generation unprofitable. The reason is that we have made ourselves dependent on production which we cannot control. When the wind blows, we get both anorectic and bulimic situation. When the wind does not blow, we have anorexia. We don't get the energy we need to our system. And then when the wind blows a lot, then we get bulimic. We get more than we can handle. And from the point of view of the poor electric grid, both are very difficult to handle. And for the financial system, it means that suppose that you have favorable wind conditions, say 1/3 of the time or a quarter of the time or something like that. Let's make it 30% just to make it easy. That means that all the other ways of producing electricity, we need electricity 24/7. That means they lose income during 1/3 of their time. You can handle that if you have an old facility which was built back in time, you have paid off the investment, and now you just have operational costs to cover. But that's not sufficient to build new plants that operate 24/7, the type of energy which is dispatchable, that you control, that you get electricity when you need it. So now we have run ourselves into the situation that thanks to the enormous spending of tax money, we have got a wind industry that doesn't make profit, and it erodes the possibility for every other way of producing electricity to cover the cost to build new plants. We can continue operating old plants, but we can't get finances in building new plants in this situation. And therefore, I voted yes to join the European Union some 25 years ago, because at that time the European Union was pro-market economy. I doubt that today. What we've seen now is that we have come into a situation where we have made all the electricity generation in Europe a communist activity. Everything has been made unprofitable thanks to spending lots of tax money. And now we're in the situation that we need to spend more and more tax money to compensate for the tax money we've already thrown in there. We're burning money, so the costs are high and they are rising. But that's only on the generation side. However, I spent a year of my life due to COVID. I lost all my clients during COVID because I couldn't travel. So I wrote a book about the power grids in Sweden, and I figured out this essentially the same all over Europe. The generation side is only half the story. You often hear the phrase, "Oh, we need all electricity." That's a deeply anti-intellectual statement, because all ways of creating electricity are not equal, and they affect the power grid, the system, in different ways. Electricity is a highly integrated system. You can actually argue that all the electricity generation and all the users and all the power lines in between, they are actually just one big machine. Everything goes together, and everything affects each other. I'm going to be a little bit technical here. In large-scale, heavy generation, that means fossil plants, nuclear plants, large-scale hydropower plants, you have so-called synchronous generators. In Sweden, if something is incomprehensible, we say, that sounds like Greek to me. Sorry, all my Greek friends. But the word synchronous is actually Greek. Syn means at the same, and chronos, time. That means generators that produce the 50 hertz of frequency which we use in our electricity grid in all over Europe. That is, they have generators that stabilize the production. You can steer that you get exactly the revolutions 50 per second that you need to keep everything under control. If you go 1% off that value, you close down the entire continent because you can't operate it. So these large, heavy installations, they are essential for the steering and control, and thereby for the stability of the power supply to the entire continent. What has happened the last 20 years is that we have closed down lots of synchronous generation and replaced with asynchronous generation. Is also Greek and means not. So that means the generators you have in wind farms, and even worse, in solar systems, they work completely different. But anyway, in wind farms, you have generators that cannot be used to steer and control what you're producing. You get what you get. The generators in those, they act like this. Okay, the generation today is 49.98. Well, then I also run 49.98. They follow what's happening in the system, but you can't use them to stabilize. You can't use them to steer the system back in case you are off the target value for everything. And that means when you get changes in the wind, you get disturbances of the entire system. And if you don't have these heavy elephants on a skewer rotating all the time in fossil plants, in nuclear and large-scale hydro, you start to get much more fluctuations in your power system. And now we come to exactly what John Constable mentioned. That costs money. I can just give you a quick number. In Sweden, we have gone from 1 to 20 billion Swedish kronor, that's about 2 billion euro, over a 5-year period, just for compensation of the disturbances that has been produced in our power system. And that is essentially all of it due to wind power. We're now to such an extent that the cost just for stabilizing the lack of stability produced by wind power in other parts of the system, which you don't see on your normal electric bill, in 4 years you can build a new nuclear power plant of that, which would produce as much as the entire wind fleet, more or less. So we have come into a situation where we spend enormous amounts of, that is, tax money to compensate for the problems created in the wind industry. At the same time, we have made the same study as Constable referred to on Swedish grounds. 85% of all the wind companies, operational companies, they make loss. The average loss is 15%. That means in 6 or 7 years, you erode the entire capital of the company. of the 15%, I'm not saying they make loss. They don't make, well, we have 15% that don't make loss. I don't say they make profit. They don't make loss. They make so small profit that not a single one of the wind companies in Sweden pays dividends to their shareholders. And that's the whole purpose of a limited liability company, not a single one of them. So what this is really about is an activity financed by tax money. And we have realized the one important source of income for these companies is green subsidies from the European Union. What happens is that you can get a bank loan for very low interest rate if you can put a green flag on your project. It turns out that essentially all wind power in Sweden is owned from elsewhere. China is the largest owner. The single largest owner is the Chinese state-owned nuclear power company CGN, and you can start to think why on earth they should run wind power in Sweden. Secondly, we have Switzerland and Luxembourg. So it's not Swedish companies, it's international companies. They start a subsidiary in Sweden, which they can let go bankrupt when it's time to clean up the mess in a few years. They get green subsidies from Brussels at extremely low interest rates because it's a green project and it will save the world. The Swedish company is operated at zero profit or somewhat loss. That Swedish company, they now have to loan money from the mother company in Luxembourg to an interest rate which is 4 or 5 times higher than the interest rate the mother company in Luxembourg gets from Brussels. And that means this is a way of greenwashing subsidies. This entire thing makes people with terribly expensive suits in London and similar places very happy, so they can throw champagne on each other. This is what happens with, if you can misuse a system, people will misuse the system, and that's exactly what we've seen. Okay, but let me then summarize. Now we're talking about all these various different aspects, but please let us take one step back and think a little bit. We have had a medical doctor giving a presentation. We have seen pictures of the human respiratory system. Suppose that you are in charge of a hospital. You have patients that have difficulties breathing. It's your job to buy a machine that helps human beings breathing so they don't die. You have 2 different technologies to choose from. One in which sometimes you don't get any air at all. Sometimes you get far more oxygen than the patient can handle. You cannot control it. It changes, it fluctuates violently. Or you can go for a system that works 24/7, gives the right amount of oxygen to the patient every second in the day, and you control how much should be given. Pick your choice. And then remember that electricity, that is what keeps poverty away. That is the basis for a high civilization with high quality of living. Electricity is the oxygen of civilization. And I turn to the European policymakers. Make relevant choices. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Blomgren. Is there anyone who have any questions?
My name is Samuel Young. I'm the assistant to Mr. Roos, and I have a question to Professor Blomgren. Because when discussing the costs of wind energy with proponents of it, they always claim that the costs of wind energy are decreasing rapidly and that the profits are actually going up quite rapidly because of innovation. Why is this untrue, and what would you say to those proponents of wind energy?
Well, the reason it's untrue is that it's based on expectations. Another way of saying is that it's based on wishful thinking. I see exactly the same thing in my home turf, that they say that, well, in a few years we will have this cost and so on. But when John Constable in the UK and people I know in Sweden actually go in and look at the audited numbers from the operators, they are read, all of them. So that's simply a lie. Secondly, what they talk about is only the actual production cost of the electricity without looking into its intrinsic value. That is, they don't look into the costs that are produced elsewhere by eroding the power grid in other places, but they're also not looking into what is the financial value when you get it. When you have lots of wind, it means that you have an excess of it. It means that the value is very low. That's not taken into account in their calculations. And it's not taken into account how expensive it is to produce something else when it's not blowing. So it's really, well, it's okay to make arguments that support your position, but this is taken to the limit, I would say, or rather beyond.
Thomas?
Yeah, my name is Thomas Brandberg. I work as a political advisor in the Swedish Parliament. I have a political question. Is it okay to take it now, or should we wait? Okay. Yeah, first of all, thanks a lot for organizing this seminar. And I think something that I noticed that we have people coming from different countries in Europe, and they are experiencing not exactly the same problems, but similar problems. And we discover here today, we discover that we have many of these problems in common. But now I have a question to the organizers. At the same time, I have discovered that there's a very solid support, very solid political support for renewable energy in this very building. So, do you see any possibility at all to block this development towards even more renewable electricity production? How would you comment on that? Thank you very much.
I would say for the moment, no. But after the next election, if people start to be waking up and see the reality, maybe.
Yeah, if people vote correctly, but yeah, that's utopia.
Well, let's be clear. We spoke about the money. This is about 40 to 50,000 billion dollars, and that's a 40 and 50 with 12 zeros, and that is a figure from Goldman Sachs. So it's really about a huge amount of money. And also Professor Bergkamp, he spoke about degrowth. This is exactly what the globalist left want us to do, degrowth. So what I see, this is a devil's pact between big corporate and the globalist left. The one gets the money, the other one gets the power. And if you step back and look from a distance, how did this started? We wanted to save the Great Barrier Reef. Do you remember? We wanted to save the Great Barrier Reef. And now the Great Barrier Reef is doing perfect. That was last year in the news. And in the meantime, we are destroying the seas in the rest of the world. But so it's just about common sense. And today we have heard all the things that it's so obvious, it's so clear that wind power, wind industry is not so renewable at all. And well, there was a nice phrase, but they all say the scientists agree, but if you silence the one who disagree, yeah, then that's what's happening now. The next mandate, I hope there will be more common sense. We see now in Germany, especially in Germany, that there is a deindustrialization going on. Big companies like BASF are moving away. They are leaving Germany. It's just not doable anymore. The cost of energy is too high. They cannot compete with other parts of the world. And also the regulations. especially for small businesses, I think it's devastating what's going on right now. I'm an entrepreneur myself, and I feel the consequences every day. So it was already said, people will not accept it anymore, but still people are still quiet, and I think we should speak more out loud, and that's why it's so important that we have events like this where we can look from all kinds of perspectives, from fishermen to ecologists, from the economy, and that we show the people that there is also a different view. I'm for 30 years in energy, for 30 years, and I speak out since the beginning of this mandate. They called me a climate denier. You're not allowed to speak, you're a climate denier. I know what I'm talking about, but you just... And these are people, they did a social study, they even kids, the young people from the Greens. And they did a social study, but they are telling us how to live. They are telling the fishermen how to work at sea. They do it for generations. They tell the farmers how to farm. These people were growing up in cities. They did a study and they grown up in cities and they still live in cities, and they are telling farmers and fishermen, etc., how to live. So I think common sense must come back. I hope also next mandate that it will come. And then I give the floor back to you. Short question.
A very small comment, actually. I will repeat what I just said. Today I discover how much we have in common. So let's everybody stay in contact.
Is there any other questions?
I just wanted to add to what you said here. I think the biggest problem we have today is that decision is made here. It should be made and stated on a local level by the people that are affected by it. We have built a system, like you said, a communist system, where we have no longer democracy out in the lands, and that's the biggest problem. So if we could move this decision from the green young people here running around making their creative ideas that is not working, to move that decision to the local people, and then we will get very good decisions, common sense, if we move the decisions to where it belongs. Thank you.
Well, one more question.
It is not a question, it's a statement. There are in Europe about 70% of the people live in cities, and the rest live outside of cities. 70% of people, that's 70% of the voters. How do you explain to the people in the cities that they should have that sort of common sense? I do not know.
For the Swedish part, I can tell you that over 50% of the population in Sweden is living in rural area or small cities or small. So more than a majority of the people are affected by the wind power from that perspective.
But that's not the case in, let's say, Central Europe. Can I just...
Very short.
Just to make a little point, that's kind of why the point about decentralization becomes even bigger, because, like I said, urban people probably shouldn't decide that you put wind powers in rural areas and vice versa. So the point is that if you move the decision making to a more local level, then you can actually take decisions that the local residents would be proud of. And there are some situations where local could be more acceptable towards wind power, for example. So it's not impossible, but then you need to move the decision making process to the local authorities.
Well, that's the principle of subsidiarity. That's what they always talk about, but they don't do that. We see we had a nice view from all perspectives today here in what's going on in Europe, but also at the other end of the ocean, they have the same problems. The increase in whale and dolphins death of the East Coast in the United States since 2016 is not due to the construction of large industry wind turbines, say the US government officials. Their scientists have done the research, they say. They prove that whatever is killing these whales is completely unrelated to the wind industry. And here you go, it's their scientists. And of course, and that's the phrase that I was searching, all scientists agree when you censor the ones who don't. But now, a new documentary, Thrown to the Wind, by director and producer Jonah Markowicz, argues that the US government officials have been lying. And it shows that the wind industry is correlated directly with specific whale deaths. Michael Schellenberger is the executive producer, and let's watch a brief extract of the trailer. Thank you so much.
That is the boat. Let's bring it to dead stop. I saw another whale had washed up. It's becoming a pattern. Is it the windmills? Is it the pounding of the seafloor? How many whales is it going to take?
There aren't many places where the North Atlantic right whale can go. It's destined to extinction.
It sounds like they're going like pile driving.
What the United States is looking at is thousands of wind turbines in an area that our whales, our dolphins, our marine life, where they live, where they migrate, where they breed. It's only when they started going into the wind lease areas that we believe that the whales are dying.
So those red dots are whale deaths.
Precisely.
What a scandal. Hey everybody, thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you. I'm very happy to hear that folks in the European Parliament are rethinking wind energy. This is something that we have been doing a lot of work on in the United States. Thank you to the member of the European Parliament, Mr. Nissinen, Johan Nissinen, for inviting my commentary. I would love to give you some hopeful news, some encouragement. We're not obviously completely there yet, but there's been some very important progress lately in the United States in terms of exposing the environmental consequences and the economic costs of wind energy. We've been involved in exposing the role of the wind industry on the east coast of the United States in causing an increase in whale deaths due to the high decibel sonar, which is in violation of US laws and has been done to map the ocean floor, as well as the impact of increased boat traffic, which has resulted in more whales dying, significant increase, as well as a cover-up by the government agencies that are supposed to be monitoring this. We have two very strong pieces of science. There will be congressional hearings in the United States this fall. And all this is coming at a time when the wind industry is obviously suffering significantly because its own costs are so high. Wind energy is a highly inefficient form of energy. It requires somewhere between 1 to 2/3 of its total cost to be subsidized. The United States has put a huge amount of money into wind energy for over 30 years, and it still requires more and more subsidies, proving the underlying inefficiency of the technology. The problem with wind, like all renewables, is that they're energy dilute, and so you have to spread wind collectors over a very large area. We've saturated most of the land areas of the United States, and that's why there's this big push to go offshore. If I could say a couple of hopeful words, encouraging words to all of you that are challenging the orthodoxy on wind energy in Europe, I would encourage you to also look into the environmental impacts. I think sometimes people emphasize the economic inefficiencies of wind energy, but the environmental impacts are just as serious, and I think they're more heartfelt by people when you see dead whales, you see the dead birds, the raptors, in Germany, I know there's been a number of lawsuits that have blocked wind energy production. I believe that's probably the case across Europe. And I think it's very important because I think people quite understandably want to spend more money on energy if we think it's going to protect the environment. If the energy is not going to protect the environment and have a negative impact on the environment, then I think people don't want to support it. So I think that the environmental issue is very important. And that if you just emphasize the economic issue, I think people might get the wrong impression that you don't care about the environment or that you don't think it's worth spending money to save the environment. And I think most people do, and rightly so. We want to save wildlife and other endangered species around the world. People want to do this. Nations are committed to this with good reason. And so we should, I think, embrace and have a new vision of conservation that emphasizes natural gas and nuclear in particular. And the reason for that is that they're energy dense, they are comparatively cheap, and they're also cleaner. They're decarbonizing, they reduce air pollution. A lot of fears about nuclear that are unmerited. I've given so many talks on it that people will have to look on YouTube to find those. And you can also see why renewables can't save the planet, which is a TEDx talk I gave. It actually has more views now than my nuclear talks. So thank you for your work in raising serious questions about the expansion of wind energy in Europe. And I encourage you, I think, keep in mind the economics of wind energy are terrible, and that we need to make the environmental case against wind, not just the economic case. I think if you combine those two things and combine it as well with a positive message for abundant natural gas and nuclear, which are both reduce carbon emissions and are the basis of civilization and a way to avoid environmental impacts on the landscapes, I think it's a winning strategy, and we should stick with it. And if we get our movements organized and energized, I think that's what will happen. And we will finally see an end to this atrociously inefficient and environmentally degrading technology. Thank you again for listening, and good luck to all of you. And please stay in touch on X, formerly Twitter, and on Substack. Please subscribe today, which is just public.substack.com, so you can get our regular communications and research reports. Thanks so much.
And now we'll give the closing to Madeleine Staff Kura from Motvind Sverige.
Well, hello everybody. Yes, my name is Madeleine Staff Kura, and I'm originally from Sweden, and I have been involved in the wind energy since 2014, when me and my neighbors one Sunday morning woke up with excavators and a construction team on our private property land. Yes, private property land. A project in Turkey, financed and erected by German entities. Despite court verdicts by the Turkish Supreme Court, we were not able to stop the intruders. And the reason is corruption. Financed and supported by the German government and green funds from Europe. And this is maybe the answer of many people's question today, why we are not being heard, why the scientists are not being able to do their work. So, therefore, can you all hear me? Yes. Therefore, I'm now very grateful to Mr. Johan Nissinen and Mr. Robert Roos for having the courage to organize this seminar. And I say courage because this is a part of the Green Deal and clearly an organized pattern of the big wind. With this collusion, with an establishment supported with tax money, feeding connivance and corruption, not only within the European Union, but also around the world, wherever they are operating. And this is a true crime to the environment. It is a true crime to the people. And it is a true crime to the next generations. So please hear me clearly, because no matter what you have been told, it is a fact that the wind energy doesn't deliver if there is no wind. It is a fact. And it also needs, as we have heard here today, a very expensive backup system working 24/7. So we need two systems as well. And it is a fact, We don't save the climate by destroying our nature. We don't become independent by building constructions of wind turbines all over our lands and in our forests and seas. And we don't become a decent law-abiding state by misusing citizens' tax money. So whatever the people who like or promote the wind energy with its politicians, that they say that we have a challenge. No, this is a problem due to bad political decisions, only favoring the multi-billion euro wind industry financed by the union's hardworking people's tax money. And this has led to this chaotic situation we do have today with the energy in Europe. And it is a green bubble that is about to burst, and the wind is not renewable. It is not green. The wind is green and renewable, but the wind energy, the wind turbines are not. So, all decisions that regarding wind are made by politicians, believing they are doing something good, but living in a green bubble, and they have forgotten all the directives that the European Union has built up and adopted during decades. And with this wrong belief, destroying our environment, power system, welfare, and democracy. So they need to take off the green glasses. It needs to be removed. And with common sense, remember the aim of the European Union, that this is a well-being of its citizens, peace and freedom, security and justice, as well as combat crime. So with this said, I wish that you all take one step forward. To the politicians, I ask you to take your responsibility and correct what has gone wrong. And even if it's in the 11th hour, we need a moratorium to rethink and to do good again. And to the journalists, I ask you to look into the abuse of power and connivance in order to reveal the fraud of the European tax money and corruption of the green funds. And to the people, I ask you to remember all this when you vote next time, in your own country and at the European election in June next year. So finally, I want to thank everybody that has had the courage and strength to come here today, to all the speakers that we had heard online, and that everyone that is struggling locally, because we are many all over the world and all over Europe that are struggling against the wind industry. And we are not climate deniers. We are not stupid. We are ordinary people living outside in the nature, doing our good everyday work as you all are. And we are in Sweden, we are in Holland, we are in France, in Belgium, UK, Ireland, Greece. We are all over and we are being ignored, and we want our voice to be heard. So because we are fighting for our health, for our private property, and for our human rights, and to achieve justice against the big multi-billion euro big wind industry. So therefore, thank you, Mr. Nissinen, and thank you, Mr. Robert Roos, and the whole ECR group that has been behind this seminar today, to enable us to be heard here in Europe, in Brussels, in this parliament. We are writing history here today. Thank you for this. Thank you so much for this. We are thousands, maybe 100,000 of people all over that are so grateful for this day. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Madeleine, for those nice words. And I will say thank you for all the participants and speakers and everyone who have been part of organizing this. You all have been very great. Thank you very much.